Hi there, I'm Park Howell, and welcome to the Business of Story, where story artists from around the world help you craft and tell compelling stories that sell. Today, we'll explore storytelling principles to help you make freaking great presentations without freaking out in the process. But first, another story marketing moment just for you. On September 20th, 2018, and I know that seems like a decade ago, I was at the lectern in the Phoenix Art Museum addressing more than 400 local business leaders on behalf of Goodwill of Central and Northern Arizona. It was its fourth annual Empower Breakfast. Goodwill sought to increase its donations at the fundraiser by 30% from the previous year. So they designed the event with storytelling at its core. I was the final speaker following empowering stories by its leadership. My job was to make, quote unquote, the ask. So I shared a simple anecdote with the audience. When I was 12 years old, I told them, I was digging fence posts with my brothers on the 12-acre home we grew up in the Pacific Northwest. Like you, the audience was probably thinking, where in the hell is this going? Well, my dad, a civil engineer and president of Constructors Pamco, a heavy construction company in Seattle, swung into the driveway on a drizzly Wednesday afternoon. When he got out of his car, I whined about having to build this cedar fence. He simply looked at me and made a memorable point about outworking the competition. He said, "A guy might want to pick up that shovel or someone else will." Then he turned and walked away. It was the wisdom of a man who grew up in North Dakota during the Depression as the son of a lumberyard operator. That was the moment I understood the importance of a strong work ethic, I told the audience. Knowing smiles lit up the faces of these alpha executives. They too appreciated what a meaningful job can do for a soul. And that is exactly what Goodwill provides through the workforce development programs we were asking the audience to invest in. What was at stake for Goodwill that morning was a fundraising goal of $200,000 to help put Arizonans back to work. But it actually raised $348,000, 75% above its goal. And that was $207,000 more than what they had raised during the same event before, more or less, the same audience at the same place the year prior. Tim O'Neill, CEO of Goodwill of Central and Northern Arizona, credited the organization's intentional approach to brand storytelling for the fundraiser's success in generating an ROI 260% above the previous year. The lesson I learned again that morning is to infuse your presentations with personal stories to invite your audience into the story, especially when you have a big ask of them. You can learn how to use these same storytelling techniques and proven frameworks to excite your audiences into action in my book, Brand Bewitchery. Or if I can help you with your sales presentations, shoot me a note at ark@businessofstory.com because I'm happy to help you excel through the stories you tell. But you can start right now learning how to speak up in your presentations without freaking out with today's guest, Matt Abrahams.
If there's any benefit of the pandemic, which is hard to find sometimes, I think the fact that all of us ended up communicating remotely for a long time really put a focus on the importance of communication and communicating well. And it is my hope that after things settle down and return to whatever normal will be, that people focus more on their communication because we saw how critically important it became. And I think if there's going to be a silver lining in some of this, communication and getting better at it is part of it.
Matt Abrahams is a passionate, collaborative, and innovative educator and coach. He teaches effective virtual communication and essentials of strategic communication at Stanford University's Graduate School of Business. Matt is also co-founder and principal at Bold Echo Communication Solutions, a presentation and communication skills company based in Silicon Valley that helps people improve their presentation skills. Matt published the third edition of his book, Speaking Up Without Freaking Out, a book written to help the millions of people who wish to present in a more confident and compelling way. He also hosts the GSB podcast called Think Fast, Talk Smart. And he curates the nofreakingspeaking.com website. That's right, nofreakingspeaking.com. Today, you'll learn the common problems that derail most speakers, the symptoms of speaker anxiety and how to overcome them, and the idea that seems counterproductive of daring to be dull. Plus, a simple three-part story structure that I absolutely love. So without further ado, please welcome to the Business of Story, Matt Abrahams. Matt, thanks for coming on the Business of Story.
I'm so excited to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, my good friend Bob DeMeo said, hey, you should listen to this guy and get him on your show. And he sent me, and I don't even remember what podcast it was, but it was about a month ago. And I was just so impressed with your approach around, high stakes presentation, getting people to get themselves pulled together so that they can have the impact they want in the presentation situation that I thought, boy, we haven't really covered this in about 6 years of shows. Let's see if Matt's available. And it's so great that you made the time to be here.
Happy to have done so.
Now, you are a rather busy individual. You've got your company and you teach at Stanford University. Are you guys back in class, in-person sessions, or are you still doing the virtual thing?
The answer is yes to both. We are in hybrid mode. So some of the students come in live and the rest are virtual, and then we rotate through. So we're getting there. We're all anxious to be back in the classroom, but we just have to wait a little bit longer.
Yeah. Well, little by little, maybe by this September, it'll be way more normal again.
That's what we're hoping for. That's what we're planning.
Now, you just published the third edition of Speaking Up Without Freaking Out, a book to help people really own pretty much any room with their presentation work. Can you give us a little bit of a backstory about how did you get into this world in presentation speaking coaching?
Well, it depends how far back you want me to go. If you want the whole full story, it dates back to when I was in high school. I was a high school freshman. As a 14-year-old, on the first day of our English class, our English teacher asked all of us to share what we did during our summer. Having the last name Abrahams guaranteed that I would go first. And I had to stand up and share my story. And at the end of class, Mr. Meredith, I still remember his name, came up to me and said, "You're pretty good at this talking thing." Those were his exact words. And he said, "I need you to go this weekend to a speech tournament where you get to give a speech and you see, how you do against other people." And being an impressionable young guy, I said, sure, just because that's what the teacher said. So I was going to do it. I prepared a speech on karate. It was something that I was passionate about then, still am today. And I get there early Saturday morning, cold, dark, go into this large room, lots of other kids just like me in jackets and ties that were too big or too short, getting ready to give my presentation in front of my parents' friends who were the judges. The girl I liked was in the room, and I was so nervous. I forgot to put on my special karate pants because I was starting in a really dynamic way. And you can tell where this story was going. I was so nervous that in the first 10 seconds of a 10-minute speech, I ripped my pants from zipper to belt buckle just because I forgot to put on the right pants because I was so nervous. And it is from that moment on that I have been fascinated by how anxiety influences our communication. I went on to study it in graduate school. I've expanded my interest in communication beyond just that. But that's really how I got interested. And the book was motivated by the learnings that I have had and the research that others have done to really help people feel more comfortable and confident when they're speaking.
So, Matt, why do you think that moment, when you were 14 years old or whatever, would have had that big of an impact on you? I mean, you must have been mortified and probably wanted to run off the stage, but you obviously didn't. You carried on. Why do you think that had such a major impact on you?
For a couple reasons. First, it was just so surprising. I had not given much thought to this activity. I was doing what I was told. It was on a topic I knew a lot about. So I wasn't expecting the anxiety. And then it hit me. And that was really the first time I had had full blown public speaking anxiety. And so that was surprising. So that's one reason it impacted me. And the other thing that I noticed was that everybody else was nervous too. And yet some were able to perform better than others. And it began to just build this curiosity in me as to why some people are able to manage this better than others, and that has fueled everything that I've done in my career in terms of being a communication coach, being a professor of communication. It's really about how is it that we can learn things to help ourselves be more confident. And when I was in the corporate world, I used to work in high tech. I saw that people who succeeded weren't necessarily the best people at the job, but they were the ones who could communicate most confidently and clearly. So that really motivated me to look into this and to try to help others.
What did you study then out of high school through college? Because it sounded like you were on this mission early on. It wasn't something that
Yeah,
you.
absolutely.
How did you prepare?
My whole academic career was stumbling into things I didn't know existed. So I started in college. I was fortunate enough to go to Stanford as an undergrad, and I thought I was going to be a doctor. And then I met calculus, and calculus and I did not get along very well. And it turned out that took me off the pre-med track, but there was an end around. There was this other program that you could try to do that could still keep you as a pre-med. And as part of that, they brought in a psychologist, an old school psychologist who talked about psychology. And I did not even know at that time that psychology existed as a field. I'd never been exposed to it. They didn't have it in my high school. And I fell in love. I fell in love with psychology. It's fascinating to me. And as I began to explore psychology, I came to learn that the area of psychology that really interested me most was communication, which I did not know was a field either. I thought communication was journalism and mass media. But it turns out there's this whole very vibrant field of interpersonal communication. Discovered it as an undergrad, went to grad school in it, graduated with an advanced degree in communication. And that passion and that inquiry has still persisted decades later.
So, what are some of the big pitfalls that you see happening all the time that you help people get through that our listeners could, consider, and any tips you might have on how to overcome that speaking anxiety?
Wow. Okay. So there are a lot of questions there. So let me break those
Yes,
down.
there
So,
were.
and yeah, feel free to interrupt me because I can wax poetic, believe me, on all the things you just asked about. So, in terms of common things people do that I think get in the way of being more effective as a speaker. First and foremost, we start from the wrong place. Most of us start in our communication, written or spoken, by saying, here are all the things I want to say. And I believe that's exactly the wrong place to start. Rather, it's what does my audience need to know? So it's not about what you want to say, it's about what they need. So becoming audience centric, being there for the audience, understanding their needs in terms of knowledge, attitudes, resistance, all of that is critical before you ever start creating content. I'm very fortunate to host my own podcast for the business school. It's called Think Fast, Talk Smart. I have not done nearly as many episodes as you have, but across all these episodes where all we do is talk about communication, the number one bit of advice that comes out is you have to be audience centric, and most people aren't. So that's my number one bit of advice. Focus on the needs of your audience, which means you have to do reconnaissance and reflection and research about who they are. The second thing is people don't spend enough time thinking about how to structure their communication. I know you are big into stories and storytelling. To me, stories are nothing more than structured communication, and they follow certain narratives and arcs, etc. But most of us just relay information rather than putting it into a structure that's relevant, concise, and clear. So first, we've got to think about our audience. Second, it's providing structure. And then third is practice. Most people think if they just think what they're going to say, that somehow magically they'll be able to say it well. I don't know about you, but in my mind, I'm amazingly eloquent. But when I open up my mouth, I'm not always as lucky. And I think other people suffer from that too. So the top three things people can focus on are being audience centric, structured, and taking the time to practice. If you do those three things, you will be well on your way to being a better communicator.
Matt, I see that all the time. In fact, I just got off of a webinar with a bunch of scientists, and we were talking about this and button, therefore, framework that we use and the importance. And by the way, I'm the odd man out because I represent in business. I represent branding and marketing, which is a foreign field to most scientists, but they bring me in because I talk about this idea of placing your audience at the center of the story. So completely, bought into what you're saying about being audience centric. And yet I am so surprised at how few people do that. You would think it would be intuitive, but it's not. Why do you think it is that we default to placing ourselves at the center of the story versus the more important person, that audience member?
So I actually think this is the bridge to talking about anxiety. I think it is because we are so fearful of being judged and evaluated that we want to make sure what we're saying is the right thing to say. And so we really fixate on ourselves and not embarrassing ourselves or setting ourselves up for failure or questioning. So it's a very self-absorbed place of origin. And yet what we know is the antidote to that is to be other focused. So I really think it comes from the fact that we are fearful and we're afraid of being judged. We want to make sure we have our stuff together. And therefore, we really become self-focused. And that includes the content that we intend to say. We think we somehow have more control over it when it is from our perspective rather than the audience's perspective. Yet all the research, and I'm sure in your own experience, you've seen being other focused and making it relevant helps the audience engage, which helps you reduce the anxiety you have.
And Matt, in your classroom, given social media and the impact it has on our, on our psyches and our communication style, and this idea of being judged and evaluated, which of course everybody contends with on social media, do you find there's maybe even more of an epidemic of me first in presenting because of how people are brought up and raised on social media, and that you have to get them to really do that mind shift, reframe it? It's not about you. It's about them.
Yeah, it's a really interesting irony that you're highlighting is most people who are savvy at social media and get all the likes and get all the followers, they're good at serving up content that's engaging for their audience, that's relevant for their audience. Yet at the same time, when it comes to their speaking, their interpersonal communication, they are very self-absorbed and focus on their needs instead of the audience. So part of what I do when I work with younger folks who are very well adept at social media is I make that connection because they don't see it as one and the same. They see, hey, those posts I make aren't the same thing as standing up and giving a speech, when I try to convince them that in fact, it is the same thing. The things that make you successful on social media, being relevant, being concise, making it engaging, are exactly the same tools that help you in your writing and in your speaking. And once that aha moment happens, these folks get a little less nervous and their communication gets a little better.
One of the best tips I got about being audience centric came from a gentleman who was a documentary filmmaker, and he was always out presenting his documentary films, and they were, quite divisive. So he would get a lot of pushback in the audience. And he said he used to have all these nerves, as we get. We all have anxiety. It doesn't matter how long you've done it. But he told me, he goes, here's what I do, Park, is when I've got a lot of butterflies, I'm going in and I'm nervous, it means my ego is driving me and I'm trying to look smart, sound smart, be perfect. As soon as I make that shift and say, it's not about me, I could have a booger come out of my nose, I could fall off the front of the stage. It is all about the audience. And no matter what happens to me on stage, I want to make sure that they leave leveled up and with this bit of information. And what I found is as soon as I started making that shift, like it took my ego out of it. I mean, I still have some anxiety, but it's like, no, it actually doesn't matter what happens to me on stage. I got to make sure that I impart this wisdom or this idea and they leave better for hearing it.
I love that story. Yeah, no, I really like that story. And I think it's really important that your anxiety can be a guide to the approach you're taking. Now, that said, I don't believe we can ever truly overcome our anxiety. Anxiety is actually adaptive. It's helpful. It tells you what you're doing is important. It gives you energy, helps you focus. My whole thing is helping people manage the anxiety so it doesn't manage them. And the ideas you're talking about and that reference from that documentary filmmaker really help in that management. So I'm fully on board with it.
What are some other things we can do to manage our anxiety when you get up there and you're just overwhelmed and you got to be stepping out there in a minute and your heart's racing and you get in? I've had this happen where I start talking too fast. I start like
Yeah.
hyperventilating and I'm like,
Yeah.
dude, you gotta chill out. What are some things we can do?
Well, let me play off those two things you just said, and then I'll give some more. So when it comes to managing anxiety, you have to take a two-pronged approach. You have to manage both symptoms and sources. Symptoms are what you physiologically experience: speaking fast, sweating, shaking, and then the sources are the things that actually make you nervous and exacerbate that anxiety. So when it comes to some sources, if you're a fast talker or you feel your heartbeat pounding really fast, taking a deep, slow belly breath can help considerably. It slows down your autonomic nervous system. And interestingly, and I'm sure, Park, you've learned this as a podcaster, you learn so much. I recently interviewed a cognitive neuroscientist at Stanford, and he said, everybody says deep breathing will help you feel better and more relaxed. And he's right. He said, you're right, but it's the exhale, it's not the inhale that does it. And I thought, what? Of course, it's a deep breath in. He said, yeah, that's important, but the exhale out. So the rule of thumb is to calm your nerves. However long you inhale, double the length of the exhale. So if you take a 3 count in, exhale for a 6 count. So deep breaths will slow down your speaking rate because your rate of speech is tied to your rate of breath. If you get shaky, simply do big, broad gestures. And those allow that adrenaline to dissipate. It gets out of your muscles and stops the shaky. And that notion that you just said of, you just got to cool it and really calm down by cooling off. When we perspire and blush, it's because we're getting hotter. So you actually literally have to cool yourself down. Holding something cold, like a cold glass of water before you speak, cools your core body temperature and makes you perspire less and blush less. So those are things you can do to manage symptoms. We also have to manage sources. Sources are those things that make our nervousness worse. Let me give you one suggestion. Many people get very nervous because they are trying to get their communication right. They want to say it right. And I am here to tell you, and Park, you'd probably back me up on this, there is no right way to communicate. There are better ways and worse ways, but there's no one right way. Yet many of us really strive for that one right way, and that puts so much pressure on us. So in a lot of the work I do, I leverage wisdom from improv. And I don't know your experience with improvisation, but there are some wonderful maxims in improv. And one of my favorite is dare to be dull. Dare to be dull. So instead of trying to be great, try just to get it done. Just do what's required in that moment. And by doing that, you take less pressure off yourself and you are more likely to do it really well. Then when you put all that pressure on yourself to do it right, you actually reduce cognitive bandwidth, and that means you're less likely to do it well. So there are symptoms and sources that need to be managed. I could wax poetic about both of those categories, but I just wanted to give you a little bit of a flavor to answer that question for you.
Dare to be dull. What happens if you end up being dull? Do you ever have
Well,
that
then,
problem?
well, I think a lot of people would tell you I do. I don't know if I feel that way, but if you're so the maxim is really saying just get it done. Give yourself permission to just do what you know how to do. And if you come off as less engaged and less energetic, it might be more inviting for the audience, and you might find that they participate more rather than when you're performing and trying to do it right. So, there's as I shared earlier, I'm big into the martial arts, and there is a Zen koan. These are puzzles and bits of advice and wisdom, and essentially the story of the koan ends with just the proverb maybe. So maybe being dull might be bad, but maybe being dull invites more engagement and reduces the status differential between you and your audience, and they feel more comfortable asking questions. So I'm not sure being dull is necessarily that bad, but certainly taking the pressure off yourself to be great is absolutely helpful for you.
It's really interesting to me. And by the way, thank you for that maxim. I'm going to use it. I've never heard that before.
Yeah, I'm going to share one more with you if you like it. So, yes and is by far the most popular improv bit of advice, but I like dare to be dull. And then there's another one that I use when I talk about listening, because one of the best ways to become audience centric is to actually listen. We focus so much in our communication on the speaking and the writing, but sometimes the most important thing to do is listen. And improv has this great saying: don't just do something, stand there. And I love it. Don't just do something, stand there. Sometimes the most important thing you can do is listen. And then from there, start your communication. So improv has a lot to teach us about how to be better communicators.
And that whole idea of don't just do something standard. Can you be doing that in a live presentation? Are you reading the
Absolutely.
room to see how they
Yeah.
are playing off of what you have to say?
Absolutely. And sometimes it's asking a question. Are there any questions? And allowing pause for those questions to develop, or asking your audience to take a poll and respond and taking that moment. So pausing, giving time for the interaction to take place. Many speakers, especially nervous ones, are rushing through it all because they just want to get to the end and put themselves out of their own misery. But in the process, they're putting their audience in a state of misery. So pausing, daring to be dull, not just doing something, standing there or waiting there, can be very powerful tools for communication.
I had a musician on, a Grammy artist, a couple weeks
Mm.
ago, Freddie Ravel, and
Hmm.
he does a lot of communications coaching. And this guy, he was like the musical director for Earth, Wind, and Fire, played
Oh,
keyboards for
wow.
Carlos Santana. I mean, big time stuff. And he is in, he's got a group or his company called Life in Tune, and he looks at
Hmm.
melody, harmony, and rhythm in your speaking. And the one thing he talked
Ah.
about that kind of marries up with what you're saying is he said the space between the notes.
Hmm.
When you're
Yes.
listening, you're really hearing the melody, you're hearing the music, but the musician has to have the space between the notes. And the same is true with the space between your words or your sentence or your ideas. And I think that kind of plays to what you're talking about there.
It sure does. And you're certainly slumming it interviewing me instead of somebody of that
Oh,
caliber.
no.
So that's awesome that you talk to people like that. But that's true. Yeah. So it's not just what you say, how you say it, the space between the words, the pausing, the cadence, the rate, all of that has impact on how you are perceived and how your message gets across.
All right, so we've put the audience first and we're working on, on those techniques. It comes down to then number 2, you had talked about structured communications. And you
Hmm.
have, I think, a really great little 3-part structure that is so memorable. When I first heard it, I go, "Oh man, I wish I'd come up with that." Can you take us through that?
So I can only imagine you're talking about my mantra: what, so what, and now what? And
Exactly.
yes. And so, as I said, I believe structure really helps. Structure helps you as a speaker in that it gives you a place to begin and end. It helps you be concise. It builds in transitions so you don't lose your audience. But structure also helps your audience because it packages up information so they can process it better. Cognitive neuroscience teaches us that structured information is processed more fluently. In other words, it gets in your brain faster and stays longer. So my favorite structure is what, so what, now what? And it works something like this. You describe what it is you're talking about. It might be your idea, your product, your service, your offering. And then you explain why it is important and relevant to the audience you're speaking to. We know that relevance helps get people's attention and helps them remember. So you explain the value of what it is you're discussing and describing. And then now what builds that momentum? What comes next? Maybe it's I'm going to show you a demo. Maybe it's we set up another meeting. Maybe it's you try it yourself. Maybe it's your turn to ask questions. So what, so what, now what is a very useful structure that you can apply in many situations. And I encourage everybody to think about how to do it. Now, you can't see me, Park, but I have a huge smile on my face right now because I
Sure.
just used what, so what, now what to define what, so what, now what. I just told you what it was. I told you how it can help you, and I encouraged you to use it. So it's a great way to answer questions, to share information, to give feedback. It's a great, powerful tool.
That's very meta too, because you
Yeah,
used
you
it
know,
on us to
I
describe how to do that.
well, in my GSB, when I teach at Stanford's Graduate School of Business, and in my GSB classes, I call that a meta moment where we take a pause and we reflect on what it was we just did or experienced. So, yes, we just had a meta moment.
So geeking out on structure just a second here. When I look at what, so what, now what, I really think of the 3-act structure of any story. So
Yeah.
what is you're setting the stage, and then you are saying, so what? So you're even first asking that question that's in that audience's mind, like, big deal, man. So what? So there's your conflict. There's your problem that you are going to now answer and address. So that's act 2, action, car chases, that sort of thing. And then the now what is act 3, the resolution, the call to action. Here's what we need to do next. And it follows that very nice problem solution dynamic that I believe our Homo sapiens brains love in
Hmm.
storytelling.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. One of the other pleasures in my life is I teach a class with a person who is a screenwriting professor at Stanford. He's also an expert at improv, and we combine communication, improv, and screenwriting, or at least storytelling skills. And he talks a lot about like what you just did, that a lot of these things follow that narrative. It does resonate with us as humans, and it's something that many of us, if it's not innate, it's something that we've all learned and gravitate towards.
And Matt, when do you start or coach your students and customers in injecting stories and little short anecdotes to create context around a bigger idea? How do you use those in big, high stakes presentations?
So I believe that evolution has designed us to pay attention to story in a way that we don't pay attention to other information like data, lists, bullet points, etc. We store information in our brains episodically. Long-term memory is episodic, that is little mini episodes. And so I encourage people to include story, anecdote, use cases in their communication. But it's not enough just to do story. You do have to provide other types of support as well, like third party testimonies, using some data as long as context is given. All of that will help your audience to really understand what you're saying. So I often, when people share with me what they want to say, I'll stop them and I'll say, okay, tell me a story about how that plays out or has played out for you or could play out for others. And just getting people thinking of it in that narrative framework brings a lot of more interesting, in-depth material to the conversation. So I definitely support using story as a way of communicating information in high stakes presentations and writing.
Hmm. And everything that you teach and in your book, I'm a big believer in, and I've seen it work time and time and time again. Why do you think it is education, academia, junior high, high school doesn't teach these basic communication skills? Because it seems like our students would be so much further ahead when they hit college if they already had this down and practiced, and certainly when they hit the job market. And just think about how much more stuff would get done in the boardroom if these MBAs were actually taught how to do this stuff.
Well, I'll tell you that at least at one institution, the MBAs are being taught that stuff. But
Could that be Stanford by chance?
it could be. It could be. So the well, one, if that were the case, you and I might be out of work. But two, I'm a former high school teacher. I taught when I left high tech. I taught high school for 2 years. I then taught at a community college for over a decade, and these skills are taught, but they're not taught explicitly all the time. Unfortunately, we get caught up in the story being told rather than how the story is being told. So, for example, in high school, I have two high school students. I see how they're being taught. They're taught literature, and then they're taught to write about the literature, but they're not taught to look at how the literature is written and how you can change and evolve. And so I think we're almost there. And in some cases, there are teachers that do this for sure. But we do need to put a premium on the ability to communicate. And we don't need to just put that on the responsibility of those people who, at least here in the US, teach English. We have to teach writing and speaking across the curriculum to really show its value. And I think if there's any benefit of the pandemic, which is hard to find sometimes, I think the fact that all of us ended up communicating remotely for a long time really put a focus on the importance of communication and communicating well. And it is my hope that after things settle down and return to whatever normal will be, that people focus more on their communication because we saw how critically important it became. And I think if there's going to be a silver lining in some of this, communication and getting better at it is part of it.
Well, let's talk about that a little bit too, because you teach on virtual communication
Mm-hmm.
and presentation technique. And let's set aside the technical side of it. Like, you got to have a good microphone and you have to have good lighting and good internet and that sort of thing. You've done all
Yes.
that. Now you are on. You have to run this meeting or you're giving a presentation. Do you see the presentation skills that you teach for presenters in person any different than what happens virtually?
So they're very similar. There are some things that you have to do. I don't know if you've heard the saying, but you have to dial it up to 11, right? So there's some things that we have to just amplify when we are in a virtual mode. So for
And you are
example,
speaking of
Spinal Tap,
Spinal
yes,
Tap, right?
I
Yes,
am
yes, yes.
indeed, of course. And I'm assuming many of your listeners have heard of Spinal Tap, but dial that up to 11 and a certain thing. So, for example, you really have to think about the orchestration of your communication in a different way than when you're in person. So, for example, you might plan out a presentation, plan out a meeting agenda, think about how you want to run it. But then you have to almost become a television producer when you are virtual. You have to think of what they call run of show. How am I going to do this? What are the timings? We know from research that you should change things up every 8 to 10 minutes. If you go longer than 10 minutes doing something that's very similar, people's attention wanes so much that it's hard to get it back. So you have to orchestrate things in 8 to 10 minute chunks. So for example, I might present a little and then I have an activity, or I might present a little, take a poll, or I present a little and have somebody else then start speaking or take Q&A. So you actually have to have two things going: the content and the narrative and story you want to tell, but then the run of show. How do you engage? How do you change things up to keep people involved? You absolutely have to frame yourself differently. When we're virtual, we have to make sure that we're looking right at the camera. And this is so hard because, especially when we've got our videos showing, we want to look at people's faces. But if I'm looking at your face and not at the camera, it's as if we were speaking in person and I'm looking down at your shoes. So there's some little things we have to do, like looking at the camera, and there's some big things we have to do, like really think about how we change things up and how we get engagement throughout the stories that we tell. So it's important to really think about it. Most people think, hey, if I can do it in person, I can just do it online. And that's not the case.
Let me ask you, do you think your axiom of dare to be dull works in a virtual setting as well as it does in a person setting? Because
Yeah.
you and I and everybody that's doing a Zoom session is producing amateur live TV. And it's, we don't want to be dull and boring. So does that axiom still work?
So here's what I want to be very clear what that axiom is representing, and then I'll answer your question. It is giving yourself permission not to be perfect and great. And that's an internal thing. I'm not saying be dull in front of the audience. I am saying allow yourself to just get the job done. So it has to do with approach, not execution. You
Gotcha.
do have to
Okay.
be more engaging. You do have to be more engaging when you are virtual, and you build in little tips and tricks to get that engagement. So you take polls, you have people writing in the chat, you use the whiteboards, you have people turning on the videos, put people in breakout rooms. All of these are ways of engaging people and keeping them focused. Think of it this way: we are asking people to pay attention to us and our message, yet we have them on the most engaging tool humankind has ever created, their computers. And we're asking them to focus on us and not all that other stuff. So you have to do things to get them engaged for sure. So I will never tell anybody to be dull. I will tell people to give yourself permission not to put pressure on yourself to be perfect, great, and right. Just get it done, and that will give you cognitive bandwidth so you can focus on these other things like being engaging and keeping the audience with you as you communicate.
I got you. And do you prefer when you are presenting virtually to be standing or sitting, or what is your recommendation
Ah,
there?
I love standing, and here's why. One, it allows me to extend my body fully so I can support my breath better. When I sit, I tend to hunch. I also habitually, when I sit, I distract myself. I'm much more passive. So I do like standing if you can. However, when we stand, we tend to sway and rock. We're not used to standing still. So I have a tip for that. Get yourself a book, a box, a stool, put one foot up on that stool stand or book, and there's no way you will sway because you will fall over. So stand up, put one foot up on something, and that will help you stay in a good solid posture, because nothing is worse than being in that little box and watching somebody swing like a tree in the wind.
Well, and I was doing all of my presentations standing. And then when I was working with the science community, the guy that was brought me in to do that, he said, "Hey, Park, would you do me a favor and sit down and slow down?" He says, "You bring too much energy for scientists," is actually what he said. And so I did, and it felt weird to me. It took me like 3 times. This was a repeating course online. The third time, I really just kind of did what you said. I just said, you know what? I'm going to dare to be dull. I didn't think that, but since you said that, I said that rattled around in my mind. And I just matter of factly talked through it. And then when they did the eval at the end of it, They said that was by far the best presentation you've ever done. And yet I felt like it was meh. It was just me there talking to them. But maybe that's exactly what they needed.
There's something about expectations, and people have certain expectations of what a good presenter is or what presentations look like. And we, as people who teach these skills, need to take that into account. Some of the things I suggest that would work for some of the people I coach to speak at Davos or TED might not work for the folks I'm teaching who are going to present at an academic conference. So we too have to be audience centric in what we do, and adjust and adapt the advice we give.
Matt, I want to ask you about facial expressions. And I guess I chalk this up to watching way too much MSNBC Rachel Maddow histrionics, where she's always rolling her eyes. And it's like, just
Right.
give me the news. But I have also found that when I am more animated in that way, using the Rachel Maddow look and eye rolls, that it seems like it works for my virtual audiences to keep them a little bit more engaged. Now, I don't know if I'm just making that up in my mind, but I would love to hear your advice on that.
So facial expressions are important. They do help your audience. So it boils down to this. We read a lot of information on people's faces. And when we don't see somebody's face, we feel very awkward and uncomfortable. And we've all experienced this with the new masking of society because of COVID. We all feel a little awkward. We're not able to tell what somebody really feels or how they're expressing themselves. So facial expressions matter. But we also have this innate desire to believe what we see, and if we feel that somebody is faking what they're doing, then they lose credibility in our eyes. So you want to be natural in your responses. It's more important that people can see them than it is that you exaggerate them. So what I mean by that is make sure you're well lit, make sure you're sitting close enough to the camera so people can see your facial expressions when you're virtual, rather than worried about really exaggerating them to communicate. Just let your response be your response. Just make sure people can actually see what that response is.
All right. So we've gone through placing your audience first, whether you're there in person or it's a virtual presentation. Structure is everything. And I just absolutely dig your what, so what, now what.
There you go.
Practice, practice, practice. Now, my wife and I were watching a stand-up comic the other day. We like to jump on Netflix, and then, of course, they're featuring a ton of them now. And, there's some of them are really, really brilliant. My wife says, how can they possibly remember all that stuff? Do they have cue cards out there? And I said, no, they're just completely practiced. I mean, they have hundreds of hours telling that same joke in that same scenario sequence over and over. So it looks like they're just winging it, but it's uber practice. And I found in my own world, the more I present, the better I get because I just know it. It just comes to me. What do you do, or do you have some ideas of how we can all do a better job of practicing so that we are very prepared when we take the screen or the audience in person?
Absolutely. So first and foremost, do not memorize. Memorizing works against you. And again, it's a simple cognitive issue here. If I have a script memorized, part of my brain, part of my ability to focus is spent evaluating how I'm doing against that script. And that gives me less resources to actually connect with the audience, see what's happening, adjust and adapt. So rather than memorize, I would like for you to practice and become familiar. And there's a difference between familiarity and memorizing. A couple of bits of advice on practicing. First, structure your content and practice the structure. So you don't have to say the same thing every time, but you say the same structure. So even a comedian might not say exactly the same words every time, but the setup and the story are the same. So give yourself an opportunity to practice the structure, not necessarily every single word in that structure. Second, practice in chunks. You don't always have to go beginning, middle, end, because we usually give the ending short shrift. We don't spend as much time on the ending. So start your practice with the ending, and then do the beginning, and then do the middle. And that will help give you some level of control over it. And then finally, when it comes to practice, record the practice and watch so you can see what it looks like, hear what it sounds like. That can be very helpful. And one extra tip, there's a lot of research that dates back from the 60s and 70s that says where you practice should be similar to where you actually deliver. So a lot of us practice in very different environments, and we don't realize that we're taking in cues and clues from the environment that are influencing how we're remembering. So I'll give you a great example. I told you already, I have two teenage kids. When they study for a test, the music's playing, they're on their phones, they got their computer videos going, and they're studying. And then they take the exam in a quiet environment, and they don't do as well. Why? Because all of those external cues and clues are missing. So the solution is not for the teacher to let them be on their phones and make a lot of noise and music. The solution is when they practice, when they study, they need to be in a quieter environment. So you want to practice the structure, not the specific words. You want to chunk or block things off so you don't do everything beginning, middle, end, beginning, middle, end. Practice in an environment that makes sense and record yourself. Those will all help you know the material better and perform better when you actually have to deliver it.
Great input. And I know those high schoolers are about ready to blast through your door right there. So I want to say thank you, Matt, for they're just around the corner. I can hear them out there, but I just want to thank you for being here, taking the time to be on the show. And where can people learn more about you and purchase your absolutely excellent book, Speaking Up Without Freaking Out?
Well, Park, thank you for having me. It is always a pleasure to talk to somebody who is as passionate about communication as I am. And so lots of ways to get in touch with me. The consulting practice that I co-founded is called Bold Echo. So boldecho.com. We want your messages to be bold and for them to echo long after you leave. I curate a website called nofreakingspeaking.com, and that really is a good resource center with my material and that of others to help people who want to be better communicators. You can buy my book on Amazon, any place you can buy books, and do consider tuning in to Think Fast, Talk Smart. You can get it at any location where you get your podcast. So Park, thank you again for the opportunity to talk to you.
Oh man, my honor. Thanks for being here, Matt, and thank you all for listening to this edition. You know what to do from here. If you liked what you heard and you've got, friends, colleagues, family members that are out there speaking and have to really own the room, well, by all means, share this show with them. Get Matt's book. It's fabulous. It's one of the best reads I've been through on public speaking, and it sure keeps me from freaking out. Not as like I've had that much of a problem lately, but still, those anxieties will creep in when you least expect it. And if I can help you with structuring your stories and even some of your presentations, come on over to thebusinessofstory.com, where I will have more tips, techniques, and talented people just like Matt there for you to help you craft and tell compelling stories that sell. And until next week, if you are an avid listener, then you know what the CTA is here. Remember that the most potent story you'll ever tell is the story you tell yourself. So make it a great one. Thanks so much for listening.